On January 3, 2026, the United States military captured a sitting president from his own palace and flew him to an American prison cell. The official reason: drug trafficking. That's not conspiracy theory. That's Pentagon press release. This wasn't about cocaine. It wasn't about democracy. It wasn't about protecting Venezuelan citizens from a dictator. This was about what happens when you stop selling oil in US dollars. And by invading Venezuela to save the petrodollar, America just showed every oil-producing nation on Earth exactly what the system really is: a protection racket backed by regime change. Picture a bedroom in the Miraflores Palace, Caracas. January 3, 2026. 3:47 a.m. local time. Nicolás Maduro is asleep. The man who controls 303 billion barrels of oil, the largest proven reserves on Earth, has no idea that American boots are already on Venezuelan soil. 12 minutes later, he's in handcuffs. 47 minutes after that, he's on a U.S. military aircraft flying north. By sunrise, the president of a sovereign nation is sitting in a federal detention cell in Miami, charged with drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. The White House called it a law enforcement operation. 147 countries called it something else: an invasion. Now, here's where most people get the story wrong. They hear Venezuela and think failed state. They hear Maduro and think dictator. They assume this was about bringing democracy to an oppressed people, about stopping drug cartels, about American values projected abroad. It wasn't. This was about 47 words in a contract. 47 words that Beijing and Caracas signed on December 28, 2025, 6 days before U.S. forces landed. The document committed Venezuela to selling 1.2 million barrels of oil per day to China. All transactions denominated in Chinese yuan. $0 US involved. $80 billion over 5 years. The world's largest oil reserve locked outside the American financial system for decades. 6 days later, Maduro was in chains. Coincidence? Maria Rodriguez still remembers the exact moment her hands started shaking. She was 34, a petroleum engineer at PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, earning the equivalent of $47 per month after hyperinflation destroyed the bolivar. That January morning, she woke to helicopter rotors slicing through the darkness. Her 6-year-old daughter ran into the bedroom clutching a stuffed rabbit. "Mami, ¿por qué hay tanto ruido?" Maria pulled her daughter close and moved to the window. Her apartment faced the palace 3 blocks away. She watched American Black Hawks circle like vultures, searchlights cutting white scars across the pre-dawn sky. She looked down at her PDVSA uniform hanging on the closet door, the logo of the company Americans had just seized by force, and realized she would wear it to work in 6 hours. Same job, same pumps, different owners. The scene felt unreal. Maria had grown up believing the Americans were partners. Her father worked the Maracaibo oil fields when Exxon and Chevron ran operations. Good jobs. Good pay. Dollars flowing into Venezuela. Venezuelan oil flowing into Texas refineries. A closed loop that made everyone rich. Now she was watching that same America kidnap her president at gunpoint, while her daughter asked why the sky was so loud. Maria didn't love Maduro. Few Venezuelans did anymore. But standing at that window, her daughter's small fingers gripping her hand, she understood something that CNN would never report, and the White House would never admit. This wasn't about who ran Venezuela. This was about what currency Venezuela used to sell its oil. And that distinction will define the next decade of your financial life. 12,000 miles away, in a government office building in Riyadh, a 52-year-old man named Fahad al-Rashid was watching the same footage on Al Jazeera. Fahad is a senior advisor to the Saudi Ministry of Finance. His job for the past 3 years has been to model what happens if Saudi Arabia starts accepting Chinese yuan for oil sales. The models sat in a folder on his desk. 18 months of projections. 20% of oil sales in yuan. A hedge against dollar dependency. A foot in both worlds. Fahad watched Maduro being dragged across his own palace courtyard. He picked up his phone and dialed the private number of the deputy finance minister. 4:23 a.m. Riyadh time. The minister answered on the second ring he'd been watching too. "Did you see?" Fahad asked. A long pause. Then, "Cancel the Tuesday meeting with the Chinese delegation. Postpone indefinitely. Say nothing to anyone." The line went dead. Fahad stared at the phone in his hand. Then he looked at the framed photograph on his desk. His two sons, ages 14 and 11, taken last Eid. He wondered what kind of world they would inherit if Saudi Arabia made the wrong choice in the next 6 months. He hasn't slept through the night since. But here's what neither Maria nor Fahad knew that morning. Here's what almost no one outside a windowless office in the Treasury Department understood. Jennifer Park is 31 years old. She's a senior analyst in Treasury's Office of International Affairs, and she was one of 12 people who saw the intelligence briefing 72 hours before U.S. forces launched. She knew about the China deal. She knew about the timeline. She also knew something her superiors refused to discuss in the briefing room. Second-order effects. Jennifer had written a 2-page memo titled Deterrence Failure Scenario. The core argument was simple: if you invade a country to force it back into the dollar system, you don't demonstrate strength. You demonstrate that the dollar requires military enforcement to survive, and every country watching will accelerate their exit plans before they become the next example. Her memo was never circulated above the deputy level. On January 2nd, her supervisor told her to delete it from the shared drive. "Above your pay grade," he said. "Focus on implementation, not outcomes." Jennifer watched the invasion coverage from her apartment in Arlington. She thought about the models she'd built, the timelines, the cascade effects. And she knew with the sick certainty of someone who sees the accident before it happens that America had just made the worst strategic mistake since Iraq. In Odessa, Texas, a man named Robert Callahan woke up on January 4th to a number that changed everything. Robert is 58. He's owned a Texaco station off Interstate 20 since 1994, bought it for $340,000, paid it off in 2008. For 30 years, he's watched the price on his pumps rise and fall with wars, recessions, hurricanes. He's learned to read oil markets the way a farmer reads weather. That morning, he checked his supplier pricing before his coffee finished brewing. Oil had jumped from $74 to $89 per barrel overnight, a 20% spike in 24 hours. Robert did the math standing in his kitchen phone in one hand, coffee pot in the other. By summer, he'd be selling gas at $5.40 a gallon. By Christmas, maybe $6, maybe higher. His customers, truckers, families driving to El Paso oilfield workers, heading to the Permian Basin, would blame him. They always blamed the guy whose name was on the sign. He didn't know about the China deal. Didn't know about petrodollar mechanics or yuan-denominated contracts. He just knew that something had happened 800 miles away, and he was going to pay for it. Imagine 2 columns on a whiteboard. On the left, countries that price oil in dollars. On the right, countries that tried to stop. Iraq. 2000. Saddam Hussein announced he would sell oil in euros instead of dollars. 3 years later, American tanks rolled into Baghdad. Libya. 2009. Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African currency to replace the dollar for oil sales. 2 years later, NATO bombs fell on Tripoli. Gaddafi died in a drainage ditch bayoneted by rebels. Iran. Decades of sanctions. Why they sell oil in yuan and euros. Russia. $300 billion in reserves frozen overnight. Why they demanded rubles for gas. Now Venezuela. Invaded. President captured. Government replaced. Every country on the right side of that whiteboard has been sanctioned, bombed, or regime changed. Every country. Here's the first question nobody in Washington wants you to ask. Why Venezuela, and why now Maduro has been in power since 2013? The U.S. indicted him on drug charges in 2020, 6 years before the invasion. If this was really about law enforcement, about bringing a criminal to justice, why wait 6 years? Why not act in 2021 or 2022 or 2023? The timing tells the truth. The China deal was signed December 28th. The invasion came January 3rd. 6 days, not 6 years. And here's the second question, the one that reveals the entire architecture of American power. Saudi Arabia has a worse human rights record than Venezuela. The Saudi government murdered Jamal Khashoggi, an American resident, a Washington Post columnist, in their own consulate, dismembered his body with a bone saw. They've bombed Yemeni hospitals, wedding parties, school buses full of children. Sanctions zero. Invasions zero. Military threats zero. Saudi Arabia prices its oil in dollars. Venezuela stopped pricing its oil in dollars. That's the only difference that matters. The dollar isn't backed by gold. It hasn't been since 1971. The dollar isn't backed by American manufacturing. We shipped that to China decades ago. The dollar isn't backed by fiscal responsibility. We're $34 trillion in debt, and adding $1 trillion more every 100 days. The dollar is backed by one thing: the credible threat that if you try to leave the dollar system, America will remove your government by force. That's not a currency, that's a protection racket. And on January 3rd, 2026, Washington showed the world exactly what happens when you don't pay protection. But here's what the Pentagon briefing didn't mention. Here's what Jennifer Park's deleted memo tried to warn about. There's a document that surfaced 3 weeks after the invasion, a leaked State Department cable that reveals the real calculation behind the operation. What it shows will change how you understand everything that's happening right now. I'll show you that document in part 3. First, you need to understand how we got here, how Venezuela went from America's trusted oil partner to America's military target. The 27-year timeline, from Hugo Chávez's first election to U.S. boots on the ground. The $17 billion in annual oil trade that Venezuela moved out of dollars. The financial architecture they built to survive. Because Venezuela didn't just leave the petrodollar, they tried to build something to replace it, and that's what made them dangerous. Maria Rodriguez still goes to work at PDVSA every morning. The American-installed government kept most of the engineers they need, someone who knows how the pumps work. Her paychecks come in dollars now. American dollars. At gunpoint. She tells herself this is stability. Order. No more hyperinflation. But every morning she walks past the courtyard where Maduro was taken. And she holds her daughter's hand a little tighter at night when the helicopters pass overhead. Because if the most powerful nation on earth has to use military force to keep countries in its currency system, how strong is that currency really? And what happens when the next country decides? The risk of staying is greater than the risk of leaving. To understand why America invaded Venezuela, you need to understand how the dollar became the most powerful weapon on earth. Not a currency, a weapon. Let me take you back to July 1944, a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Imagine the scene: 730 delegates from 44 countries sitting in a ballroom, cigarette smoke hanging in the air, maps spread across tables. World War II is still raging. Europe is in ruins. And these men are designing the financial architecture that will govern the planet for the next century. The United States made an offer. We hold most of the world's gold, 70% of all monetary gold on Earth, locked in Fort Knox. We will back our dollar with that gold. Every dollar will be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. And if you peg your currency to the dollar, you'll have stability. You'll have access to American markets. You'll have protection. 44 countries accepted. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. Not because it was the best currency. Because America had the gold and America had the guns. This is the part most people misunderstand about the dollar's power. They think reserve currency status is an honor, a recognition of economic strength, a reward for good behavior. It's not. Reserve currency status is a protection racket. Countries hold dollars because they need dollars to buy oil to trade internationally to access the global financial system. and they need American permission to do any of those things. The system worked beautifully for America until 1971. That's when Richard Nixon faced a problem. The Vietnam War was expensive. Social programs were expensive. America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back. Foreign countries started noticing. France sent a warship to New York Harbor to collect their gold. Literally. A warship. Nixon had two choices. Stop printing money or break the promise. He broke the promise. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. The system that had governed global finance for 27 years ended with a Sunday night television address. But here's what happened next. The moment that should have ended dollar dominance actually strengthened it. In 1974, Nixon sent Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia with a proposal. The offer was elegant in its brutality. Saudi Arabia would sell all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. In exchange, America would provide military protection for the Saudi regime. Weapons, training. The implicit promise that no matter what the Saudis did, no matter how they treated their people, their neighbors, their enemies, America would keep them in power. King Faisal accepted. The petrodollar was born. Think about what this meant. Oil is the most traded commodity on Earth. Every country needs it. And now every country needed dollars to buy it. If you're Germany and you want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, you can't use euros. If you're Japan and you want to buy oil from Kuwait, you can't use yen. You need dollars. This created permanent structural demand for the dollar. Every country on Earth had to hold dollar reserves. They had to buy American Treasury bonds. They had to participate in the dollar system not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. The petrodollar didn't replace the gold standard. It replaced gold with oil. And oil was better than gold because oil gets consumed. Gold sits in a vault. Oil burns. Every barrel burned means another barrel purchased. Another dollar demanded forever. Henry Kissinger understood this perfectly. He's reported to have said, "Control oil and you control nations. Control food and you control people. Control money and you control the world." The petrodollar gave America control of all three. Now let me show you how this system actually works in practice. Because this is where the mechanism becomes clear. Imagine you're running a small business, a coffee shop. You have a regular customer, let's call him the landlord of the building next door. Every day he comes in and buys coffee. He pays in a special currency that only he can print. And here's the deal. If you want to rent space in his building, you have to accept his currency. If you want to buy supplies from any of his other tenants, you have to use his currency. If you try to use any other currency, he'll make sure no one rents to you, no one sells to you, no one does business with you. That's the dollar system. The landlord is America. The tenants are every other country. The special currency is the dollar. And the enforcement mechanism isn't eviction notices, it's sanctions, frozen assets, and aircraft carriers. But here's the thing about protection rackets. They only work as long as everyone believes the landlord is invincible. The moment someone successfully pays rent in a different currency, the whole building starts asking questions. That's what Hugo Chavez did. Remember Maria Rodriguez from Part 1. Her father worked the Maracaibo oil fields in the 1980s. He was part of the system. Venezuelan oil flowed to Texas refineries. American dollars flowed to Caracas. PDVSA was a model petrodollar partner. Maria's father used to tell her stories about the American engineers, the barbecues at the company compound, the baseball games. He called those the good years. What he didn't understand, what Maria wouldn't understand until she was standing at her window watching Blackhawks circle, was that the good years had a price. Venezuela was prosperous, but it was not free. Every barrel of oil came with an invisible leash. As long as that leash held, everyone was happy. Hugo Chavez cut the leash. In 1999, Chavez was elected president on a platform of economic nationalism. He looked at Venezuela's oil wealth and asked a question that wasn't supposed to be asked. Why are we selling our oil exclusively to the United States? Why are we accepting only dollars? Why are we keeping our reserves in American banks where America can freeze them whenever it wants? These were dangerous questions. Not because they were wrong, because they were right. In 2000, Chavez flew to Iraq. Imagine that scene, the president of an oil-rich American ally shaking hands with Saddam Hussein on international television. Saddam was under American sanctions. He was the official enemy. And Chavez stood next to him and announced that Venezuela would trade oil to Iraq in exchange for goods. No dollars. Barter. The message was unmistakable. Venezuela was testing the boundaries of the system. The system pushed back. In April 2002, Venezuelan military officers attempted a coup against Chavez. He was arrested, removed from the presidential palace, told to sign a resignation letter. The United States immediately recognized the coup government. The State Department had talking points ready. It was later confirmed that the CIA had been in contact with coup plotters for months. But something unexpected happened. The coup failed. Venezuelan civilians flooded the streets demanding Chavez's return. Military units loyal to the president turned against the coup plotters. Within 48 hours, Chavez was back in the palace. He returned with a new understanding. America would not tolerate deviation from the dollar system. Negotiation was impossible. The only path forward was to build an alternative system strong enough to survive American retaliation. This is the mini-climax that changed everything. Before the coup, Chavez was a reformer working within the system. After the coup, he was a revolutionary trying to destroy it. Between 2003 and 2013, Chavez systematically dismantled Venezuela's integration into the dollar system. He nationalized oil projects, forcing ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips to give up majority ownership or leave. He paid off all debts to the IMF and World Bank, then withdrew from both institutions entirely. He began selling oil to China under long-term contracts denominated in yuan, with Chinese infrastructure loans repaid in oil shipments, no dollars involved. By 2008, Chavez was openly calling for the end of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. He proposed a South American currency called the sucre. He built alliances with Iran, Russia, and China based explicitly on creating a non-dollar trading bloc. And then came the second question no one in Washington wanted to answer. If the coup didn't work, what would? The answer was economic warfare. Think about this, in terms you might understand from your own life. Imagine you have a neighbor who decides he doesn't want to shop at your store anymore. He starts buying from a store across town. Annoying, but not illegal. Now imagine you could call every other store in town and tell them not to sell to your neighbor. You could call his employer and get him fired. You could call his bank and freeze his accounts. You could call the gas station and refuse to fill his car. You could call the hospital and deny him medical care. That's what sanctions are. America doesn't just refuse to trade with you. America makes it illegal for anyone else to trade with you. And because the dollar system runs through American banks, American courts, American jurisdiction, almost every international transaction can be blocked if America decides to block it. Starting in 2015, the Obama administration imposed targeted sanctions on Venezuelan officials. The Trump administration escalated massively in 2017. They banned American companies from buying Venezuelan oil, eliminating 500,000 barrels per day of sales, $13.7 billion in annual revenue gone overnight. They froze Venezuelan government accounts in American banks, $7 billion inaccessible. They prohibited American companies from providing shipping insurance or financial services to Venezuelan oil tankers. They banned the sale of spare parts for Venezuela's American-built oil infrastructure. The result was systematic economic destruction. Venezuelan oil production collapsed from 2.4 million barrels per day to 500,000, an 80% drop. Government revenue cratered. The economy imploded. Hyperinflation reached 1.7 million%. People starved. The official explanation was human rights and democracy. But Iran has worse human rights. Saudi Arabia has worse human rights. Neither faces anything close to this level of economic warfare. The actual explanation was simpler. Venezuela had to be made an example. Any country thinking about leaving the dollar system needed to see what would happen. And here's the contrarian point that changes the entire frame. The sanctions didn't work. Not in the way they were supposed to. Venezuela didn't collapse back into the dollar system. Venezuela adapted. They found new buyers. China, India, Russia. They built barter networks with Iran and Cuba. They created bilateral payment mechanisms that bypassed the dollar entirely. By 2025, Venezuela was selling 900,000 barrels per day in non-dollar currencies. They had survived the worst economic warfare America could deploy. They had proven it was possible to leave. That's what made the January invasion necessary. Sanctions had failed. Coups had failed. Economic destruction had failed. The only option left was military force. But everything I've shown you so far was just the setup, the slow squeeze, the failed attempts to bring Venezuela back into line through everything short of direct invasion. What happened on January 3, 2026, and what's happened in the 14 countries watching from the sidelines, since that's where the dollar death spiral actually begins. December 28, 2025. Beijing. Picture a conference room on the 47th floor of the China National Petroleum Corporation headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A mahogany table long enough to seat 30 people. On one side, Chinese energy officials in dark suits. On the other side, Venezuelan ministers who had flown 14 hours to be here. The document in front of them was 142 pages long. But only 47 words mattered. All petroleum transactions under this agreement shall be denominated in Chinese yuan. Payment shall be rendered through the cross-border interbank payment system. No transactions shall utilize U.S. dollar clearing mechanisms or pass through U.S. regulated financial institutions. 47 words. $80 billion over 5 years. 1.2 million barrels of oil per day permanently locked outside the dollar system. When Venezuelan Energy Minister Tarek El Aissami signed the final page, he looked up at his Chinese counterpart and said something that would later appear in a leaked diplomatic cable. Today we stop asking permission. 6 days later, American Special Forces kicked down his president's bedroom door. Now here's what most people get wrong about the January 3rd invasion. They think it was about Maduro. They think it was about drugs, about terrorism, about democracy. The White House said it was a law enforcement operation. The Pentagon called it a precision strike against narco-terrorism. It was none of those things. The invasion was a message. And the message wasn't for Venezuela. Imagine a map of the world's oil-producing nations. Color them by how they price their oil. Green for dollars, red for non-dollar currencies. In 2020, almost the entire map was green. Saudi Arabia green, UAE green, Kuwait green, Iraq green. We made sure of that. Nigeria, Angola, Kazakhstan, all green. The red spots were small. Iran under sanctions for decades. Russia increasingly red after 2022. Venezuela stubbornly defiantly red. But by December 2025, the red was spreading. Not because countries wanted to leave the dollar, because they were starting to believe they could. The China-Venezuela deal wasn't just about oil. It was proof of concept. If Venezuela, under the most aggressive sanctions America had ever deployed, could build a functional non-dollar export system, anyone could. That's what made January 3rd necessary. Not punishing Venezuela, terrifying everyone else. Remember Jennifer Park from Part 1. The Treasury analyst who wrote the memo her supervisors told her to delete. 3 weeks after the invasion, she sat in a classified briefing at the State Department. The topic was international reaction assessment. A senior official stood at the front of the room with a PowerPoint presentation. The title slide read, Operation Petrol Shield Strategic Communications Review. Jennifer listened as the official explained the messaging strategy. Emphasis on drug interdiction. Emphasis on Venezuelan humanitarian crisis. Emphasis on restoring democracy. Focus groups had been conducted. The narrative was testing well. Then someone asked about the oil contracts. The official paused. That's being handled through separate channels, not relevant to the communication strategy. Jennifer raised her hand. What about second-order effects, Saudi reaction, Chinese countermeasures? The official smiled. Above your pay grade. That phrase again. Jennifer walked out of the briefing, knowing with absolute certainty that the people running this operation had no idea what they had just triggered. They were measuring success by news cycles and approval ratings. They weren't measuring the phone calls happening in Riyadh, in Beijing, in 14 foreign ministries around the world. The calls were happening. Fahad al-Rashid, remember him, the Saudi Finance Ministry advisor watching Maduro's capture at 4 a.m. By January 10th, 1 week after the invasion, Fahad had been summoned to 3 emergency meetings. The first was with the deputy finance minister, the man who had told him to cancel the Chinese delegation meeting. The second was with representatives from the Saudi Central Bank. The third was with someone whose name Fahad was instructed never to repeat, a member of the royal family's inner economic council. The question in all 3 meetings was the same. If they did this to Venezuela, can they do it to us? Fahad had spent 3 years modeling Saudi Arabia's options. He knew the answer. Technically, yes. Saudi Arabia held $120 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. Saudi Aramco processed all transactions through dollar-clearing banks. Saudi Arabia's entire economy ran through systems America controlled. But practically invading Saudi Arabia would crash the global economy. It would trigger $300 oil. It would collapse the Treasury bond market. It would end the petrodollar more decisively than anything Venezuela could do. So the question wasn't whether America could invade Saudi Arabia. The question was whether America's willingness to invade Venezuela made staying in the dollar system more dangerous than leaving. After the 3rd meeting, Fahad went home and looked at that photograph of his sons again. Then he opened his laptop and began drafting a new model. This one wasn't about gradual yuan diversification. This one was about rapid exit scenarios. Timeline 18 months. He titled the document, Contingency Protocol. He did not save it to the ministry's network. Pause this video for 10 seconds. Consider what you just heard. The invasion of Venezuela was supposed to strengthen the dollar system. It was supposed to terrify countries into compliance. Instead, it's causing America's most important ally in the petrodollar system to quietly plan their escape. That's not deterrence. That's acceleration. Now continue watching, because what happened next is even worse. On January 15, 2026, 12 days after the invasion, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a statement. The language was diplomatic, carefully calibrated. But the substance was a declaration of economic war. China expresses grave concern regarding recent unilateral actions that violate the sovereignty of nations and the principles of international commerce. China reaffirms its commitment to providing alternative trade and financial mechanisms for nations seeking to conduct business free from coercive interference. Translation: if America is going to invade countries for leaving the dollar, China will protect countries that want to leave. Within 72 hours, China announced accelerated implementation of 3 programs. First, expansion of the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, to include direct connections with central banks in 37 countries. Second, a $50 billion emergency credit line for oil-producing nations facing economic pressure from external actors. Third, a formal invitation to all BRICS nations to participate in developing a commodity-backed reserve currency. The dollar didn't strengthen after January 3rd. It began its death spiral. But here's the twist that changes everything. The invasion didn't just fail strategically. It revealed something America had successfully hidden for 50 years. Pull up two photographs in your mind, side by side. On the left, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, a country that executes people for apostasy, a country that dismembered a Washington Post journalist in its own consulate, a country that has bombed Yemeni school buses, hospitals, wedding parties. Since 1974, the United States has sold Saudi Arabia $178 billion in weapons, provided military training, overlooked every human rights violation, protected the regime from every consequence. On the right, Caracas, Venezuela, a country that nationalized its oil industry, a country that sold oil to China instead of Texas, a country whose president, whatever his flaws, was democratically elected and never murdered a journalist with a bone saw. That country was invaded. Its president kidnapped its government, replaced by American military force. The difference between these two photographs is not human rights. The difference is not democracy. The difference is not drugs or terrorism or any of the words that appeared in the White House press release. The difference is the currency they accept for oil. Write that down. Remember it the next time someone talks about American values, American principles, the rules-based international order. There are no values. There are no principles. There is only the dollar. And the dollar is maintained by whatever violence is necessary. Now let me show you who understood this first. In Moscow, a man named Sergei Glaziev had been waiting for this moment for a decade. Glaziev is 63 years old, an economist who serves as Minister for Integration and Macroeconomics of the Eurasian Economic Commission. He's been called Putin's economic brain. He's been predicting dollar collapse since 2014. On January 4, 2026, one day after the Venezuela invasion, Glaziev was already drafting an emergency proposal. He didn't need to convince anyone. The invasion had done his work for him. The proposal outlined a 90-day acceleration of Russia's de-dollarization program. All remaining dollar reserves converted to yuan gold and a basket of non-aligned currencies. All oil contracts with friendly nations shifted to ruble or yuan settlement. All Russian companies required to maintain less than 5% of assets in dollar-denominated instruments. The proposal was approved in 11 days. 11 days. Russian bureaucracy normally moves like Soviet concrete. 11 days. What does that tell you about how Moscow read the situation? In New Delhi, India's finance minister called an emergency session on January 7th. India had been quietly building rupee-based trade channels with Russia since 2022. Now they accelerated. India announced it would accept rubles for wheat purchases and pay for Russian oil in a rupee-ruble mechanism that touched no American banks. In Brasilia, President Lula, who had clashed with Washington before, publicly condemned the invasion as a return to the worst traditions of Yankee imperialism. More importantly, he signed an executive order directing Brazil's central bank to increase yuan reserves from 5% to 15% within 6 months. In Pretoria in Jakarta, in Ankara in Cairo, similar conversations. Similar calculations. Similar conclusions. The invasion didn't demonstrate American strength. It demonstrated American desperation. And desperation is weakness wearing a mask. Here's the question that every foreign ministry asked in the 2 weeks after January 3rd. If America is willing to invade Venezuela to stop de-dollarization, what are they willing to do to us? And here's the answer they arrived at. It doesn't matter what America is willing to do. What matters is that we have to leave anyway. Because staying in a system maintained by military invasions is not safety. It's hostage-taking with extra steps. The petrodollar worked for 50 years because it was invisible. Countries held dollars because dollars were useful, stable, accepted everywhere. They didn't think about why they held dollars. They just did. It was the water they swam in. January 3rd made the water visible. It showed everyone the guns behind the currency, the aircraft carriers behind the exchange rate, the regime change behind the reserve status. You cannot unsee that, and once you've seen it, you cannot trust the system the same way again. Here's micro hook number 1. The 14 countries that issued a joint statement calling for alternative payment systems. That was public. What wasn't public was the meeting that happened 3 days later. A secure video call between finance ministers from 9 of those countries. What they discussed would have caused a constitutional crisis in Washington if it leaked. It did leak. I'll show you what they said in part 4. Now let me take you inside the 72 hours that followed the invasion, because this is where the death spiral became irreversible. Oil prices on January 2nd, $74 per barrel. Oil prices on January 5th, $89 per barrel. A 20% spike in 3 days. That wasn't market speculation. That was risk repricing. Every barrel of oil on Earth became more expensive because every country that sells oil suddenly faced a new calculation. What if we're next? Remember Robert Callahan, the gas station owner in Odessa, Texas. By January 10th, he was selling regular unleaded at $4.15 per gallon. His suppliers had already told him to expect $4.80 by February. His margin was collapsing. His customers were angry. Robert is a patriot. He voted for the president who ordered the invasion. He believes in American strength, but standing behind his counter, watching families wince at pump prices, he started doing math he'd never done before. If this invasion was supposed to help America, why was he paying more for gas? If controlling Venezuela's oil was supposed to secure American energy, why were his costs going up instead of down? Nobody from Washington was going to answer those questions. But Robert knew something was wrong. He could feel it in every transaction. And Robert wasn't alone. Across America, 63 million households were paying more for gas, more for groceries, more for everything that moved on trucks or trains or ships. The invasion tax. The price of maintaining dollar hegemony through military force. But even that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened in the bond market. On January 8, 2026, the U.S. Treasury held a routine auction for $42 billion in 10-year bonds. These auctions happen all the time. Foreign governments buy them. Pension funds buy them. The Treasury gets cash to fund the deficit. Everyone wins. This auction was different. Foreign central bank participation dropped to 47%, the lowest level since 2009. China, which usually buys $8 to $12 billion per auction, bought $3 billion. Saudi Arabia, usually reliable for $4 or $5 billion, bought $1.8 billion. The auction still cleared. Domestic buyers filled the gap. But the signal was unmistakable. Countries were reducing their exposure to dollar assets, quietly, methodically, one auction at a time. The Treasury Department noticed. The Federal Reserve noticed. But what could they do? You cannot force foreign governments to buy your debt. You cannot invade countries for not attending bond auctions. Or can you? Here's microhook number 2. There's a classified briefing document that circulated within Treasury's Office of Debt Management in late January 2026. It was titled Sovereign Participation Scenarios Stress Test Analysis. I've seen excerpts. What it projects for the next 18 months would terrify anyone with a 401k. I'll walk you through those projections in part 4. But first you need to understand what happened next. Because everything I've shown you so far, the invasion, the oil spike, the bond market tremor, that was just the first domino. The second domino fell on January 22, 2026. That's when Saudi Arabia made its move. The call came at 6 a.m. Washington time. The Saudi ambassador requested an urgent meeting with the Secretary of State. No agenda provided, no talking points shared in advance. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. When it ended, the Secretary of State walked back to her office and closed the door. She sat at her desk for 11 minutes without speaking to anyone. Then she picked up the secure line and called the White House. What she told the president would change the trajectory of American power for the next 50 years. The petrodollar as we knew it had just received its death sentence. The Saudi ambassador delivered a single sentence that January morning, a sentence that would echo through the next decade of American decline. The kingdom has decided to accept yuan for 15% of oil sales to China effective March 1, 2026. 15%. That's the number that killed the petrodollar. Not 100%. Not 50%. 15. Because the petrodollar was never about total control. It was about exclusive control. The moment Saudi Arabia, the founding partner, the anchor of the entire system, accepted payment in anything other than dollars, the exclusivity ended. And without exclusivity, the system had no foundation. The Secretary of State asked for clarification. She asked about the timeline. She asked about reversibility. The ambassador was polite but firm. This decision reflects the kingdom's need to diversify economic relationships in an uncertain global environment. Recent events have clarified the risks of dependency on any single currency or any single partner. Recent events. He didn't need to say Venezuela. Everyone in the room heard it anyway. Now let me show you what happens when a reserve currency dies. Because it doesn't collapse in a day. It doesn't explode like a bomb. It bleeds out over years, over decades, 1 percentage point at a time. Picture a graph. The horizontal axis is time 2026 to 2037. The vertical axis is the dollar's share of global reserves. In January 2026, that share stands at 58%, already down from 72% in 2001. Watch what happens. March 2026. Saudi Arabia begins yuan settlement. Dollar share drops to 55%. June 2026. Nigeria and Angola announce partial yuan acceptance. Dollar share 53%. October 2026. The BRICS, New Development Bank, launches a pilot commodity-backed settlement currency for member nations. Dollar share 51%. January 2027. Kazakhstan. The UAE and Indonesia join the yuan oil settlement system. Dollar share 48%. By mid-2027, for the first time since World War II, less than half of global reserves are held in dollars. The drop doesn't stop. It accelerates. Each country that leaves makes leaving easier for the next. Each percentage point lost reduces the benefits of staying. By 2030, 41%. By 2033, 34%. By 2037, 27%. 27%. That's not a reserve currency. That's just another currency. One option among many. No special privileges, no exorbitant advantage, no ability to print unlimited money and force the rest of the world to absorb the inflation. But the dollar share was just the visible consequence. The hidden consequence, the one that would take decades to measure, was what happened to American purchasing power, American savings, American lives. Let me introduce you to Michael Torres. Michael is 34 years old in 2026, a logistics manager at a trucking company in Phoenix, Arizona. He makes $67,000 per year. He has a 401k with $43,000 in it, mostly index funds. He has a mortgage on a 3-bedroom house in Gilbert, purchased in 2022 for $385,000. Michael didn't vote in 2024. He doesn't follow geopolitics. He has no idea what the petrodollar is or why it matters. But the petrodollar's collapse is about to define the next 30 years of his life. By late 2026, inflation hits 8.7%. The Federal Reserve raises rates to 7.25%. Michael's adjustable rate mortgage resets. His monthly payment jumps from $100 to $400. He refinances, locks in at 8.1%. Payment stabilizes at $2,900. Still $800 more per month than before. By 2028, the dollar has fallen 23% against major currencies. Everything imported costs more. Michael's company ships auto parts from Mexico. Costs up 31%. The company cuts staff. Michael keeps his job, but his raise is 2.1% against inflation of 9.3%. He's getting poorer every year while working the same hours. By 2030, gas is $7.40 per gallon. Michael sells his truck, buys a used hybrid. His 401k has grown to $61,000 in nominal terms, but in real purchasing power, it's worth $38,000 less than when he started. By 2035, Michael is 43. He's moved his family to a rental apartment in Tucson because he couldn't keep the Gilbert house. His retirement projections show he can retire at 71 if everything goes well. His parents retired at 62. Same country, different system, different outcome. Now let me introduce you to Wei Jianming. Wei is 34 years old in 2026, a logistics manager at a shipping company in Shenzhen, China. He makes 280,000 yuan per year, about $39,000 at 2026 exchange rates. He has a comparable amount in retirement savings. He has a mortgage on a 2-bedroom apartment purchased in 2022. Wei also doesn't follow geopolitics closely. But the same global shift that's destroying Michael's future is building Wei's. By late 2026, the yuan has strengthened 8% against the dollar. Wei's purchasing power for imported goods increases. His company, which ships manufactured goods globally, is suddenly more competitive. American and European companies are paying more yuan for Chinese products. The company expands. Wei gets promoted. By 2028, China's Belt and Road Network has integrated 17 new countries into yuan settlement systems. Wei's company opens offices in Indonesia, Nigeria, and Brazil. Wei is offered a position managing Southeast Asian logistics. His salary doubles. By 2030, Wei buys a second apartment as an investment. Property values are rising with the economy. His retirement savings invested in Chinese markets that are now attracting global capital fleeing the dollar have grown 47% in real terms. By 2035, Wei is 43. He owns 2 properties outright. His retirement projections show he can retire at 58 if he chooses. His children will attend university without debt. Same skills, same work ethic, same profession, different side of the Pacific. All doubts. Different outcome. This is not about individual choices. This is not about who worked harder or who was smarter. This is about which currency system you were tied to when the music stopped. And here's the question no politician will answer honestly. How many Americans like Michael will pay for the decisions made in Washington? How many retirements will be destroyed? How many houses lost? How many futures foreclosed? The answer is tens of millions. The answer is a generation. Remember Maria Rodriguez from Part 1. The PDVSA engineer who watched the helicopters circle the palace while her daughter asked why the sky was so loud. By 2030, Maria has left Venezuela. Not because she wanted to, because the American-installed government privatized PDVSA's engineering division and a Texas company brought in their own people. She took a job in Mexico City working for Pemex. She makes less than she made in Caracas before the invasion. Her daughter is learning her 3rd language. Maria sends money home to her mother every month. She watches Venezuelan news on her phone late at night after her daughter is asleep. The oil is flowing again to American refineries priced in American dollars. The invasion worked from Washington's perspective. But when Maria closes her eyes, she still sees the searchlights. She still hears the rotors. And she knows something that Michael Torres in Phoenix doesn't understand yet. The empire that did this to her country is doing it to its own people too. Different mechanism, same extraction. But the visible collapse was just the beginning. The hidden consequence would take decades to measure. Let me show you the mechanism that's still unfolding. When a reserve currency loses status, 3 things happen simultaneously. First, foreign governments stop buying your debt. Second, your currency weakens against competitors. Third, your domestic inflation becomes your problem alone. You can no longer export it to the rest of the world. America had been exporting inflation for 50 years. Every time the Federal Reserve printed money, those dollars went overseas to pay for imports to settle oil trades, to sit in foreign central bank vaults. The inflation pressure went with them. When foreign countries start selling those dollars back, when they stop accumulating and start dumping, the dollars come home, and they bring the inflation with them. Jennifer Park, the Treasury analyst from Part 1, left government service in 2028. She'd written 17 memos warning about reserve currency transition risk. 15 were ignored. 2 were classified. None changed policy. She took a job at a hedge fund in Connecticut, helping them position for exactly the scenario she'd tried to prevent. She made more money in 2029 than she'd made in her entire government career. She also developed insomnia that would last the rest of her life. Some nights, she runs the numbers again, not for the fund, for herself. She calculates what would have happened if her memos had been read. If the invasion hadn't happened. If the petrodollar had declined gradually instead of crashing. The difference in her models is $14 trillion in American household wealth. Lost. Not transferred, destroyed. Evaporated in the gap between what the dollar was worth and what it became. That's the number Jennifer sees when she can't sleep. $14 trillion. Enough to fund Social Security for 40 years. Enough to rebuild every road and bridge in America. Gone. And the invasion that triggered it was sold as protecting American interests. Here's the contrarian point that changes the entire frame. The petrodollar collapse wasn't inevitable. It wasn't the result of unstoppable historical forces. It was a choice. The United States could have allowed the dollar's share of reserves to decline gradually from 58% to 45% over 20 years instead of crashing to 27%. That would have been manageable. Painful, but manageable. A slow adjustment instead of a crisis. The invasion accelerated everything. It turned a gradual transition into a panicked exit. Countries that might have stayed in the dollar system for another decade fled in months because they saw what happened to Venezuela and decided they couldn't risk being next. America chose empire over stability. And American citizens paid the price. Now let me show you the pattern that proves this wasn't an accident. Iraq, 2000. Saddam Hussein announces, Iraq will sell oil in euros. 2003, invaded regime changed oil contracts returned to dollar denomination. Libya, 2009. Muammar Gaddafi proposes a gold-backed African currency for oil sales. 2011, NATO intervention. Gaddafi killed currency plan, abandoned. Venezuela, 2017. Maduro accelerates de-dollarization. 2017 to 2025, sanctioned, strangled economy collapsed. 2026, invaded president, captured oil sales, returned to dollars. Syria, Iran, Russia. Sanctions isolation regime change attempts. Always the same pattern. Always the same trigger. If the same mechanism produces the same results in 7 different countries over 23 years, is it a bug or a feature? It's a feature. The petrodollar system was always maintained by force. The invasions weren't exceptions to the rules. The invasions were the rules. January 3, 2026 didn't reveal something new. It just made the old truth visible enough that the rest of the world couldn't ignore it anymore. Picture a timeline. 1974, petrodollar created with Saudi Arabia. 2026, petrodollar dies with Saudi Arabia. 52 years. The same country that started the system ended it not through hostility, but through rational self-interest. Saudi Arabia saw what America did to Venezuela and concluded that loyalty to the dollar system meant vulnerability to American violence. The system designed to ensure American dominance for a century lasted barely half that time. Not because enemies destroyed it, because America destroyed it themselves through the very actions meant to preserve it. Fahad al-Rashid, the Saudi advisor who canceled the Chinese delegation meeting after watching Maduro's capture, never returned to that meeting. He was reassigned to the team implementing Saudi Arabia's yuan transition. The same models he'd built to assess whether de-dollarization was possible became the models that made de-dollarization happen. By 2030, Fahad had been promoted twice. His sons, the boys in the photograph on his desk, were studying at university in Singapore, not London, not New York. Singapore. When asked about January 3, 2026, Fahad gives the same answer every time. That was the day we understood. Understood what? That the dollar was a prison, and Venezuela showed us what happens when you try to leave peacefully. So we left quickly. And this brings us to the present. Because the system designed in January 2026, the post-petrodollar world, is still operating today. The consequences I've described aren't predictions. They're happening. The American standard of living is adjusting downward. Retirement ages are rising. Home ownership rates are falling. The implicit promise that every generation would do better than the last, that promise is breaking. And every day, the dollar buys a little less. The empire shrinks a little more. The bill comes due, one invoice at a time. But here's what nobody in Washington wants to admit, and what nobody on cable news will tell you: there's still a choice to be made. The decline is real, but the trajectory isn't fixed. What happens next depends on what Americans understand about how they got here and what they demand from the people who put them here. That's what Part 5 is about. Not what we've lost. What we might still save. Let me take you back one final time to that apartment in Caracas, January 3, 2026. Maria Rodriguez is standing at her window, her daughter's small fingers wrapped around her hand, watching American helicopters circle the presidential palace. She doesn't know about the 47 words in the China contract. She doesn't know about Fahad al-Rashid in Riyadh, staring at his phone calculating whether his country is next. She doesn't know about Jennifer Park in Arlington, watching her deleted memo come true in real time. She doesn't know about Robert Callahan in Odessa, about to watch his gas prices climb every week for the next 2 years. She doesn't know that this moment, this exact moment, is the hinge point of the 21st century global economy. All she knows is that her daughter is scared, and the sky sounds like war, and tomorrow she will put on her PDVSA uniform and go to work for whoever won. That's what history looks like from the inside. Confusion, fear, the sense that something enormous is happening, but no framework to understand it. Now let me show you what Maria couldn't see that morning. Picture a map of global dollar transactions animated over time. January 2026, 85% of oil trades settle in dollars. Watch the green fade. March 2026, Saudi Arabia's announcement. The green recedes from the Middle East. June 2026, Nigeria. Angola, Kazakhstan. The green pulls back from Africa and Central Asia. By December 2027, the map is half green, half red. By 2030, more red than green. Maria didn't cause this. Maduro didn't cause this. Hugo Chavez, for all his rhetoric, didn't cause this. The United States caused this. By invading Venezuela to save the dollar system, they proved to the world that the dollar system required invasions to survive. And a currency that requires military enforcement isn't a currency, it's a threat. The moment you show people the gun behind the money, they start looking for money without a gun behind it. Here's what most people still don't understand. The petrodollar didn't die because America's enemies destroyed it. The petrodollar died because America's actions made staying more dangerous than leaving. Every country that fled the dollar after January 2026 made a rational calculation. Saudi Arabia, with $120 billion in treasury bonds, concluded that American alliance meant American control, and American control meant potential American violence. Better to diversify. Better to have options. Better to not be Venezuela. That's not anti-American sentiment. That's self-preservation. And you cannot build a reserve currency on other countries' fear of being invaded. Remember the two photographs I asked you to picture in Part 3, Saudi Arabia on the left, Venezuela on the right. Same question applies today to every country watching. Which side of that photograph do you want to be on? And what determines which side you end up on? The answer hasn't changed. The answer is still what currency you accept for your exports. Now here's the contrarian point that challenges even this narrative. There is no villain in this story. Not really. The officials who planned the Venezuela invasion believed they were protecting American interests. The analysts who warned against it believed they were protecting American interests. The Saudi advisors who fled the dollar believed they were protecting their nation's interests. Everyone acted rationally within their own framework. The system doesn't require evil intent. It only requires incentives applied consistently over time. American policymakers were incentivized to maintain dollar hegemony by any means necessary. Foreign governments were incentivized to escape a system that punished independence. Once those incentives were set, the outcome was almost mechanical. The invasion wasn't a choice made by villains. It was a choice made by a system that had no other moves left. That's the uncomfortable truth. The decline of American financial power isn't a story of heroes and villains. It's a story of structures and incentives, and those structures are still operating. Let me show you where Maria is today. It's 2027. She's in Mexico City now, working for Pemex, the Mexican state oil company. Her daughter is 9, fluent in Spanish and English, learning Mandarin in after-school classes. Maria chose the Mandarin program deliberately. She's seen which direction the world is moving. On her desk, she keeps a photograph from Caracas, her father in his PDVSA hard hat, standing next to an American engineer, both men smiling. The good years, her father called them. The years when the system worked, when everyone benefited, when the gun stayed hidden. Maria looks at that photograph sometimes and wonders if her daughter will ever see years like that. Or if the age of hidden guns is over forever. She doesn't have an answer. Neither do I. What I have is a framework. Not for predicting the future, no one can do that. Not for telling you what to buy or sell, that's not what this video is for. A framework for understanding what you're seeing when you watch the news, when you hear politicians talk about national security and economic competition and the rules-based international order. When you hear about a country being sanctioned, ask, what currency are they using? When you hear about regime change or military intervention, ask, what were they doing with their oil? When you hear about the dollar being strong or weak, ask, strong compared to what and enforced by what? These questions won't tell you the future, but they'll help you see the mechanism. And once you see the mechanism, you stop being surprised. You stop being manipulated. You start understanding why things happen, not just that they happened. Jennifer Park, the Treasury analyst, teaches a seminar now at Georgetown. International Monetary Systems. Her students are 22, 23 years old. They don't remember a world before January 2026. To them, the multipolar currency system isn't a disruption. It's just how things are. Jennifer shows them the memos she wrote, the warnings that were ignored. She doesn't do it to say, I told you so. She does it to show them that the future is always visible before it arrives if you know where to look. Last semester, a student asked her, if you could go back to 2025 and change one thing, what would it be? Jennifer thought for a long moment. Then she said, I wouldn't change the policy. I'd change the assumption behind the policy. The assumption that American power could be maintained through force indefinitely. That was the error. Everything else followed from that. The student wrote it down. Jennifer wondered if it would make any difference. Robert Callahan sold his gas station in 2029. Couldn't make the numbers work anymore. Margins too thin. Prices too volatile. Customers too angry. He's retired now, living on Social Security and a small pension. He drives past the station. Sometimes it's a charging station, now owned by a Chinese company that's building EV infrastructure across the Southwest. Robert doesn't understand exactly what happened to the world he grew up in, but he knows it's gone. And he knows that the people who made the decisions that ended it never paid any price for those decisions. That's the part of the story that doesn't fit into economic models or geopolitical analysis. The human cost. The gas station owners and logistics managers and petroleum engineers whose lives were shaped by choices made in rooms they'll never enter, by people they'll never meet. Understanding this history won't tell you what to do with your savings. That's not the point. The point is to see the pattern, so that when the next Venezuela happens, when the next currency war escalates, when the next invasion is sold. As law enforcement, you'll recognize the mechanism. You'll know what questions to ask. You'll understand what's really being protected and at whose expense. The petrodollar lasted 52 years. The system that replaces it is still being built. The decisions being made right now in Beijing, in Riyadh, in Washington, in rooms we'll never see, will determine what the next 50 years look like. Maria's daughter is learning Mandarin. Robert's grandchildren are inheriting a country with a weaker currency and fewer options. Jennifer's students are preparing to navigate a world their professors never imagined. The pattern doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes. Reserve currencies rise when they're useful and fall when they're feared. Empires expand until the cost of expansion exceeds the benefit. Systems survive until the people inside them realize they're trapped. January 3, 2026 was the day the world realized the dollar was a trap. What happens next is still being written. Currencies don't die in a day. They bleed out over years while the people holding them insist everything is fine. And if the most powerful nation on earth has to invade countries to keep its currency dominant, how long before there's no one left willing to hold it? The dollar was never backed by gold. It was backed by the belief that America would never have to show the gun. On January 3, 2026, they showed the gun, and the belief died with it.